So finally, under priority area 4, we have a few illustrative indices and actions, and then Annex 2 provides some nice examples of how policies can be designed. I will just allude to this at the end of this podcast and then make it a separate podcast. It's got nice data, figures, and some interesting insights on how per capita GDP and various factors like access to electricity, water, sanitation, etc. work, and why that should affect climates. Okay, so here priority area 4 is manage financial and macro fiscal issues, considering the importance of having the entire system be ready for the shocks while also helping people and firms to adapt, deal with residual risks, and in general manage the entire business of facing up to risks that are evolving with climate change. This section becomes very important, because without financial and macro fiscal issues completely figured out and dealt with, this is going to be a dangerous issue, especially for developing countries, which are highly vulnerable to climate change. And it's always pointed out that they didn't really contribute much to what has happened this far in terms of emissions and their impacts. That's all done by the developed world. But the highest vulnerabilities are in these countries, the so-called global south, which didn't actually contribute much to climate change itself through their emissions. Of course, they have large populations and habitat losses and pressures on natural resources like water, biodiversity, forests. Coastal regions are important for all countries, but still. So action 4.1 under this: include contingent liabilities from natural disasters and environmental shocks into the planning and budgeting process, which is very critical, because you don't want to be caught unawares when a climate shock hits, in terms of how to adjust your budgeting to deal with the disasters. And this is already discussed elsewhere in my podcast, showing that just dealing with current crises may make you less and less able to plan for the future. This is a very dangerous situation. So here, risk to public assets and corresponding contingent liabilities should be assessed. Emergency and social protection spending needs and corresponding contingent liabilities are also assessed. Explicit and implicit contingent liabilities are quantified and included in budget documents. Risk to GDP and tax revenues are estimated and included in budget documents. Action 4.2 then is on developing a financial strategy to manage contingent liabilities, combining multiple instruments. Percentage of explicit and implicit contingent liabilities covered by instruments such as reserve funds, contingent credit lines, and insurance products is well known. Disaster escape clause in budget process is approved, so that when the budgetary priorities are made to spend on certain things, if a disaster hits, then you should have enough room to reallocate funds so that you have an escape clause. Process in place to manage inflow of international aid in case of major disaster, including using existing financial instruments to coordinate delivery, like people's bank accounts, firms' bank accounts, and so on. PDPFM, Public Finance Management Review, conducted and approved. PDPFM principles and processes approved. Action 4.3, anticipate and plan for long-term macroeconomic impacts. That's public debt, I suspect. You please look it up. I'm blanking out right now. Sector level adaptation plans collected, harmonized, and costed. An estimate of public adaptation spending needs are produced. Long-term plan to diversify tax revenues away from vulnerable sectors is approved. So we talked about sunrise and sunset sectors and how to facilitate the transitions of both. Here we are talking about vulnerable sectors. Could be fisheries, could be agriculture, could be coal, for example, and so on. Share of tax revenues originating from high vulnerability sectors is mapped out. Climate and disaster impacts included in debt sustainability assessment or financial sector assessment program. This is all good plans, good action items, but helping developing countries manage these is going to take some thinking in terms of global action, especially for reducing the entire humanity's vulnerability and risk for the future and enhancing resilience to climate change. Action 4.4: communicate and mitigate the disaster and climate risk exposure of financial sector and pension systems. People work their lifetime and then are relying on pensions, and if something goes wrong, it can be a massive disaster, psychologically and otherwise. All banks, insurance, and large investor regulations include specific disaster and climate risks requirements. All banks, insurers, and large investors conduct stress tests for climate and disaster risks, including at least 2 climate scenarios, which we discussed, and I have separate podcasts on these for the national network of greening the finance system, which is recommended and being taken up by the Europeans, and that's been converted to region-specific assessment stress tests for the banking system in the US as well. All banks, insurers, and large investors required to provide a quantified estimate of their exposure to natural hazards. If it is done as a compliance requirement so far, then they may just do something to satisfy the compliance aspects, but if they begin to see it as an actual way to hedge their bets and improve their returns and reduce debt defaults, etc., then banks will do much better job of taking risk-informed decisions on lending and other banking activities. Okay, I'll leave this here. We'll come back and look at a separate podcast on Annex 2, which is example of indicator-based identification of policy priorities. Has some nice data and interesting results, as I stated earlier. So we'll do this as a separate podcast and then decide where to post it, either in one of the sections or separately. Okay, let's meet in the next podcast then.